There is a village on the north coast that was raided and burned to the ground by a Spanish war fleet. The only time in the entire war that Spain successfully landed and torched an English town. There is a mine where 31 men fell into the darkness of the earth in a single terrible instant. And there is a black, bottomless pool out on the moor where the legend says the ghost of a damned man has been bailing out the water with a holed seashell for 300 years and will go on bailing until the end of time. This is Cornwall. To the outside world, it's a holiday postcard. Golden beaches, cream teas, surfers. But turn off the main roads, follow the narrow lanes down to the sea or up onto the moor, and you find a different Cornwall entirely. A land of shipwrecks and smugglers, of drowned villages and stone circles, of settlements so remote and so strange that they feel like the very edge of Britain, because they are. These are the weirdest and most isolated villages in Cornwall. Before we set off, if you love this kind of forgotten history, the lost villages, the dark legends, and the strange corners of Britain that time left behind, do one quick thing. Hit that subscribe button. It's completely free. It helps this channel more than you know, and it means you'll never miss a single one of these journeys into the hidden past. Right, with that done, let's begin. And we begin on the north coast, in a place where the sea itself once tried to wipe a village off the map. The village is Boscastle, a tiny ancient harbour tucked into a deep, twisting gorge where two rivers meet the sea. It is one of the most picturesque spots in Cornwall. It is also home to something you would not expect to find in a sleepy English village: the largest museum of witchcraft and magic in the world. For decades, this remote harbour has housed thousands of objects tied to folk magic, spells, curses, and the dark old beliefs of the Cornish countryside. Charms to ward off evil, tools of village wise women, relics of a world that took witchcraft very seriously indeed. And then, in August 2004, something happened that the superstitious found impossible to ignore. After hours of freak torrential rain, the two rivers above Boscastle burst into a single monstrous flash flood. A wall of water tore down the gorge, ripping cars out into the sea, smashing buildings and very nearly destroying the village in an afternoon. By some miracle, no one was killed, but half of the Witchcraft Museum's collection was swept away and lost. A village of witches very nearly drowned by a flood that came out of a clear summer sky. From a village nearly destroyed by water, we go to one that was destroyed by fire, and by an enemy from across the sea. Down at the far southwestern tip of Cornwall, clinging to the edge of Mounts Bay, lies the ancient fishing village of Mousehole, a huddle of granite cottages around one of the oldest harbours in the county. It looks impossibly peaceful now, but in the summer of 1595, this was the site of one of the most shocking events in English history. A squadron of Spanish galleys, part of the Great War against Elizabethan England, landed right here in Mounts Bay, and they sacked and burned Mousehole to the ground, along with the neighbouring villages of Newlyn and Penzance. The local militia could not stop them. Homes, the church, the whole village, put to the torch by Spanish soldiers on English soil. It remains the only time in the entire war that Spain managed a successful major landing in England. And it happened here, in this tiny, forgotten Cornish harbour. But Mousehole's story with the sea did not end there, because this same village suffered one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in modern Cornish memory. In December 1981, a ship got into trouble in a savage storm offshore, and the local lifeboat launched into the teeth of it to save them. Every man aboard that lifeboat was a volunteer, and nearly all of them came from Mousehole itself. The lifeboat was lost with all hands. 8 men from this one tiny village, gone in a single night, leaving a community of a few hundred people shattered by grief. To this day, every December, Mousehole lights up its harbour with strings of lights. But on the anniversary of that night, they are switched off, and the village stands in darkness, remembering. The sea gives Cornwall its beauty, and the sea takes its people. And no one understood that better than the strange and remarkable man of our next village. High on the wild cliffs of the far north coast sits Morwenstow, the most northerly parish in Cornwall. A lonely, windswept place where the land ends in sheer drops to a churning sea that has claimed countless ships. In the 1830s, its vicar was a man named Robert Hawker, and he was, by any measure, one of the most eccentric clergymen who ever lived. He wore a fisherman's jersey and long sea boots. He talked to birds, kept a pig as a pet, and built himself a little hut out of driftwood on the cliff edge, where he would sit for hours, smoking opium and writing poetry while he watched the sea. But Hawker's real work was grim. This coast was a graveyard for ships, and when the storms wrecked them on the rocks below, it was Hawker who climbed down to the shore to recover the broken, drowned bodies of the sailors, so that they could have a proper Christian burial instead of being left to the tide. He buried dozens of them in his churchyard, and the white figurehead of one wrecked ship, the Caledonia, still stands over the grave of her lost crew, a carved wooden guardian watching over the men the sea gave back. Morwenstow, a parish at the end of the land, kept by a vicar who made it his life's work to bury the drowned. Cornwall's coast was deadly, but its greatest dangers were not always above the ground. Sometimes they were deep beneath it. Along the cliffs near the village of Pendeen and St. Just stand the ruined engine houses of Bottleac and Levant. The skeletons of Cornwall's great tin and copper mines perched dramatically on the very edge of the cliffs, some of them with shafts that run out for over a mile beneath the floor of the Atlantic Ocean itself. Miners once worked down there in the dark and the heat, so far under the sea that they could hear the boulders grinding and rolling on the seabed above their heads with every wave. It was one of the most dangerous jobs in Britain, and on the 20th of October 1919, at Levant, it turned to catastrophe. The mine used a device called a man-engine, a huge, constantly moving rod fitted with steps that carried the miners up and down the deep shaft. That afternoon, as dozens of exhausted men rode it back up toward daylight at the end of their shift, a metal link at the top of the engine snapped. The entire mechanism, packed with men, plunged down the shaft. 31 miners were killed and many more horribly injured in a few seconds of falling darkness. The engine houses stand empty now, romantic ruins that tourists photograph against the sunset. But each one is a monument to the men who never came back up. The mines emptied the villages of the west, and out on the great brooding wilderness of Bodmin Moor. In the heart of Cornwall, we come to the loneliest, strangest place on this whole list, and to that vicar who preached to no one. The village is Warleggan, a scatter of houses deep in the moor, about as remote as anywhere in Cornwall. And in 1931, it received a new rector, the Reverend Frederick Densham. He did not last long in the hearts of his parishioners. Within a year, his cold, autocratic manner had turned the entire village against him. He preached vegetarianism to a parish of farmers. He fenced off the rectory with barbed wire. He banned the village socials the community loved. One by one, his congregations stopped coming to church, until, in the end, not a single soul would sit in his pews. But Densham did not leave. He stayed. And every Sunday, for years, he rang the bell and held the full service in that cold stone church, preaching to nobody. It said he even set out little cards on the empty pews, each bearing the name of one of his predecessors going back hundreds of years, so that he could read out a congregation of the long dead. He lived alone in his barricaded rectory, more and more of a recluse, cut off from every living person around him. And there, in 1953, at the age of 83, he was found dead on his own staircase, entirely alone, a living ghost. In the most isolated church in Cornwall, the Moor makes hermits of men. And it breeds legends darker than any ghost story, because not far from Warleggan lies a stretch of black water that sits at the very heart of Cornish myth. It's called Dozmary Pool, a lonely reed-fringed lake out on the empty moor with not a building in sight. For centuries, local people swore it was bottomless, that it had no floor at all and dropped straight down into the underworld. And two of Cornwall's greatest legends are tied to this desolate spot. The first is the legend of King Arthur, for it is here, at Dozmary Pool, that many believe the dying king ordered his sword Excalibur to be thrown back into the water. And a hand rose from beneath the surface, the Lady of the Lake, caught the blade, and drew it down into the deep forever. And the second legend is far darker. It's the story of Jan Tregeagle, a wicked man, who, after his death, was condemned by the devil to an impossible eternal punishment, to empty the bottomless waters of Dozmary Pool, using nothing but a limpet shell with a hole in it. And they say he is out there still, on the black nights, bailing and bailing at the endless water, and that on the wildest storms you can hear him howling across the moor as the demons hunt him. A lake with no bottom, a magic sword, and a damned soul that has been scooping the sea into a broken shell for 300 years. And Bodmin Moor has one more secret waiting on its lonely road, a place that became a byword for the very worst of old Cornwall. Standing alone in the middle of the moor, miles from anywhere, is Jamaica Inn, an old coaching house on the bleak main road across Bodmin. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, this was smuggling country, and worse. This wild, unpoliced coast and moor was the territory of the smugglers who ran contraband up from the shore. And of the wreckers, the men accused in legend of luring ships onto the rocks with false lights so they could plunder the cargo, and, in the darkest versions of the tale, murder any survivors who crawled ashore. Jamaica Inn, isolated and secretive out on the moor, became the very symbol of that lawless world, a place where smugglers gathered and travellers disappeared. It was made famous by the novelist Daphne du Maurier, who stayed here, was captivated by its brooding isolation, and turned it into one of the most atmospheric novels in the English language. To this day, it's said to be one of the most haunted buildings in Cornwall. Footsteps, voices, and a man who walks in from the murderous night that never quite ended. From the crimes of the moor, we return to the coast, to a village that simply vanished and left a mystery behind it. On a remote fold of the North Cornish coast lies the tiny hamlet of Port Quinn, a cluster of old cottages around a narrow, cliff-shadowed inlet. And for a long time, Port Quinn was known as the village that died overnight. The story that clung to it for generations was a chilling one, that the entire male population of the village, every fisherman, every able-bodied man, went out to sea together one night, and that not one of them ever came back, drowned all of them in a single storm. And that the widows and children they left behind, unable to survive without their men, simply gathered what they could and walked away, abandoning the village to the wind and the sea and leaving the cottages to rot. Whether the truth is quite so dramatic or not, the fact remains that Port Quinn was, for many years, a genuine ghost village. Silent, empty, its houses standing hollow above the water, a whole community that dwindled to nothing and left only its bones behind. Port Quinn lost its men to the open sea. But along the south coast lies a stretch of water so deadly it earned a name that says it all, and a village whose graveyard tells the story. Off the Lizard Peninsula, hidden just beneath the waves, lie the Manacles, a nightmare reef of jagged rocks that has torn the bottoms out of more ships than almost anywhere else in Britain. For centuries, vessels sailing up the channel were dashed to pieces here in the fog and the storms, often within sight of land. And the little village that looks out over them, St. Keverne, became the place where the drowned were brought ashore. Its churchyard holds the bodies of hundreds of shipwrecked sailors, the victims of disaster after disaster, including the terrible wreck of the liner Mohegan in 1898, which went down on the Manacles in clear weather one autumn evening, for reasons never fully explained, taking more than 100 souls with her. Row upon row of graves for people whose names were never even known. A quiet Cornish village, forever tending the harvest of one of the deadliest reefs in the world. And where there were wrecks, there were also men who profited from the chaos. None more brazen than the smuggler who ruled our next hidden cove. Tucked into the cliffs of Mounts Bay is a secret little inlet called Prussia Cove, and it takes its name from one of the most extraordinary characters in Cornish history. In the 18th century, this remote cove was the private kingdom of a smuggler named John Carter, who styled himself the King of Prussia. From this hidden, hard-to-reach landing, Carter and his brothers ran a vast and organized smuggling operation, hauling contraband, brandy, tea, and tobacco up from the shore and away into the country, right under the noses of the authorities. Carter was so bold and so sure of his own little realm that on one famous occasion, when the excisemen seized goods he considered rightfully his, he simply broke into the customs house and stole them back, taking only what belonged to him and nothing more, so that the officers reputedly knew at once it must have been the honest King of Prussia, an entire criminal empire run from a cove so isolated that the law could barely find it. And rising out of the water in that very same bay is perhaps the most extraordinary sight in all of Cornwall. A village and a castle on an island that is cut off from the world twice a day, every day, by the sea itself. St. Michael's Mount is a great pyramid of rock, crowned by a medieval castle and church, sitting just offshore in Mounts Bay, with a tiny community living in its shadow at the water's edge. At low tide, an ancient stone causeway rises out of the sea, and you can walk across to it dry shod. But when the tide turns, the sea rolls back in and swallows the causeway whole, and the mount becomes a true island, marooned, unreachable, its handful of residents cut off from the mainland until the waters part again. For centuries, it was a place of pilgrimage and a fortress against invasion. And the old legend says the mount was built by a giant named Cormoran, who waded ashore to steal the villagers' cattle until a local boy dug a pit, lured the giant to his death, and became the Jack the Giant Killer of the fairy tale. A castle on a rock, a giant beneath the causeway, and a community that lives to the rhythm of the tide, isolated by the sea twice every single day. Cornwall's isolation isn't only on its coasts. Up on the high moorland roof of the county, there are places stranger still, where the landscape itself is said to hold people frozen in stone. Near the highest inhabited point in Cornwall sits the old mining village of Minions on the edge of Bodmin Moor, and beside it stand 3 ancient stone circles known as the hurlers. The old story explains them perfectly in the grim moral logic of the Cornish past. These standing stones, they say, are not stones at all. They are men who dared to play the game of hurling on the holy day of the Sabbath, and who were punished by God for their sin by being turned to stone where they stood, frozen forever in the act of their game. Nearby stand 2 more lonely stones, called the pipers, the musicians who played for them, turned to stone for the same crime. Walk out among them on a grey day, with the mist rolling across the empty moor, and not a soul in sight, and it is very easy to believe the tale. A circle of the petrified dead, standing in silence on the roof of Cornwall. And there is one more moorland marvel before we reach the end, a place that looks like something out of a nightmare or a dream. Rising straight up out of the flat moor near the village of Roche is Roche Rock, a jagged, dramatic spike of black stone, and clinging to the very top of it, impossibly, are the ruins of a tiny medieval chapel and hermitage. Centuries ago, a hermit lived up there, sealed away on his pinnacle of rock above the moor, cut off from all human company by choice, devoting himself to God in the wind and the emptiness. And this eerie crag, too, is woven into the legend of Jan Tregeagle, for it was to the chapel on Roche Rock that the damned man was said to flee, screaming, thrusting his head through the ruined window to beg for sanctuary, while the devil's hounds bayed for him below. A ruined church on a needle of rock, home once to a hermit, and haunted forever by a fleeing ghost. But before the final village, there is one more Cornish legend we have to face. Because the greatest lost settlement of all may lie not on the land, but beneath the sea off the very tip of the county, out past Land's End, where the Atlantic stretches away toward the Isles of Scilly. The old Cornish people believed there once lay a rich and beautiful country called Lyonesse. A whole land, they said, dotted with towns, and no fewer than 140 churches, joining the mainland to Scilly, across ground that is now open ocean. And then, in a single catastrophic night, the sea rose up and drowned Lyonesse forever. swallowing every town, every church, every living soul in one great flood. Only one man is said to have escaped, a rider named Trevelyan, who galloped ahead of the roaring water on a white horse and reached the high ground just in time, while the entire kingdom vanished behind him beneath the waves. And to this day, the fishermen off Land's End tell of nets that snag on walls and rooftops far out at sea, and swear that on quiet nights, from deep beneath the water, you can still hear the drowned church bells of Lyonesse ringing in the dark. A whole lost world, sleeping under the ocean, at the very edge of England. And hidden in a wooded valley back on the mainland is one last strange and sacred place. Before we reach the end, tucked into a deep, secret glen not far from the north coast is St. Nectan's Glen, where a stream falls 60 feet through a perfect round hole it has bored in the rock into a dark pool below. For as long as anyone can remember, this hidden waterfall has been considered one of the most spiritual places in Cornwall, a site of pilgrimage, of quiet worship, of old belief. A holy hermit is said to have lived in a cell above the falls in the age of the saints. And to this day, visitors who find their way down into the glen tie ribbons to the trees, build little stacks of stones, and leave messages for the dead, until the whole hidden valley shimmers with the offerings of the grieving and the hopeful. A secret waterfall at the bottom of a forgotten valley, where people have come to touch something older than the church for well over 1,000 years. And so, at last, we come to the most famous and perhaps the most powerful of all Cornwall's isolated places. The one that sits at the very edge of the land and at the very heart of the British imagination. On the wild north coast, where the cliffs fall away in dizzying drops to the sea, lie the ruins of Tintagel Castle, a broken medieval fortress built on a great crag of rock that is almost an island, joined to the mainland by only the narrowest neck of land. It is one of the most spectacular and windswept places in all of Britain, and it carries the single greatest legend these islands have ever produced. Because Tintagel, according to the old stories, is the birthplace of King Arthur. It was here, they say, that Arthur was conceived and born, here that the wizard Merlin worked his magic, and in the dark sea cave that runs right beneath the crag, a cave you can still walk into at low tide, as the waves boom through the darkness, that Merlin is said to have carried the infant king to safety, or to have laid down to sleep for 1,000 years. For 1,500 years, people have come to this lonely, thunderous, half-drowned rock at the end of Cornwall, and felt that they were standing at the source of the myth. The castle is a ruin, the wind never stops, the sea crashes in the cave below. And whether Arthur was ever real or not, Tintagel remains exactly what Cornwall itself is, a place at the very edge of the world, where the line between history and legend simply dissolves into the sea mist. And that is Cornwall. Not the postcard, the real one. A land where the sea burns villages and swallows men, where vicars preach to empty pews and hermits live on spikes of rock, where the stones are frozen sinners and the pools are bottomless and a magic sword lies waiting in the dark water. These are the places at the end of the road, the end of the land, the end of Britain itself. Remote and strange and unforgettable. If you want more of the forgotten and the isolated corners of these islands, the villages the world drove past, then subscribe and we'll take you to the next one. Because out here at the edge of Cornwall, the old stories never really died. They're just waiting down this next narrow lane for someone to come looking.